Story 1. Lindy Chamberlain, known as the Dingo Ate My Baby Lady, lost her baby in terrible circumstances. She was accused of killing her baby and became a subject of ridicule. She was telling the truth and was entirely innocent. Poor woman. How do you even come back from something like that? Story 2. Paul Rubin, also known as Pee Wee Herman. I just watched his documentary on HBO. The criticism he received for not being normal was intense. He is such a lonely, creative soul. Story 3. All the interpreters in the Middle East who supported United States soldiers were mistreated by the United States government when they were not given the green card or citizenship that was promised. Story 4. McMartin Preschool Case, the most famous and longest-running example of the satanic panic daycare abuse hysteria of the 1980s. Allegations. Children were allegedly sexually abused in bizarre, ritualistic, satanic ways, including secret tunnels, flying witches, and animal sacrifices. No convictions were ever made. Charges were dropped against defendants. Ray Buckey was acquitted after 7 years of investigation and trials. It became one of the most expensive criminal cases in United States history, costing over $15 million. This was the case that started the whole event. Story 5. Alan Turing deserves a huge apology from his government. He did so much for the Allies in World War II but was then chemically castrated for being gay, which eventually led to his suicide. God rest his soul. Story 6. Stella Liebeck is the woman from the McDonald's lawsuit. She said she was doomed to become a laughingstock and unfortunately passed away before people fully understood the actual situation. Story 7. Brooke Shields. It's like every adult 50 years ago just decided, you know what? This one time we are going to let this slide. Story 8. Emmett Till. That poor child and his mother. Obviously, it was too late, but his accuser should have paid for what she did. Story 9. Monica Lewinsky was involved in a relationship with President Bill Clinton in the White House. However, she faced severe public criticism for 20 years. She had secretly confided in Linda Tripp, who betrayed her by recording their private phone conversation. Linda Tripp then gave the recording to the press. Story 10. Anarcha, Lucy, and Betsy were 3 enslaved black women who were repeatedly experimented on without anesthesia by the physician known as the father of modern gynecology. Story 11. Surprised nobody is mentioning George Stinney. In 1944, he was wrongfully convicted of capital murder and the rape of 2 white girls and was given the death sentence. His father was fired from his job a few days later, and the town attempted to lynch George, but he had already been moved to a different town jail. His trial was rigged from the start, with his family not being allowed to enter, leaving George with no witnesses to testify to his innocence. It was not until December 2014 that his conviction was formally overturned by Judge Mullen. Story 12. Anita Hill was publicly humiliated for being a victim of sexual harassment by several men protecting Clarence Thomas. She was then pressured into endorsing one of the perpetrators in 2020. Story 13. Breonna Taylor. No one should be shot while lying in bed, especially when the police have the wrong address. Story 14. The nurse whom Kyle and Jackie O, Australian radio personalities, tricked into giving information about the royal family committed suicide. Story 15. Adriana Smith. Her body was kept for 100 days after brain death to allow a 9-week-old fetus to reach the point of potential viability, though it will suffer its entire life. Growing inside a decaying, rotting body causes harm. Her 7-year-old child is now without a mother, who died because she was not allowed to have an abortion for life-saving surgery. Rest in power, Adriana. We failed you. Story 16. The man who saved people from a bomb attack and was then wrongfully imprisoned for supposedly planting the bomb himself to be the hero was Richard Jewell. He died 2 years after being freed. Story 17. Anyone who has been lied to or misdiagnosed by a doctor. Most people I have met in healthcare are amazing, but there are also many rotten apples. Story 18. Nikola Tesla developed most of the modern technology we take for granted today. The only reason most people do not know him is that he was not a businessman like Thomas Edison, who successfully convinced others that his technology was superior. Story 19. Any woman who has died because her pain was not taken seriously by medical professionals. The false stigma that women are dramatic overshadows the hard truth that women experience worse physical pain through natural processes such as the menstrual cycle and childbirth and can handle pain better than men. If women say it hurts, it hurts. Not believing women has had deadly consequences. Story 20. Not as much as some other people on this list, but Sarah Jessica Parker. What was her crime? Not having a tiny button nose. Everyone called her a horse and turned her appearance into a punchline, which I still see people do on this website even after she got a nose job. My first exposure to her was in Hocus Pocus, and I thought she was very pretty. The mocking way people talk about her never made sense to me. Story 21. Any person who was wrongly convicted for harming or killing a rapist in self-defense. These individuals are often convicted as if they harmed a person out of pure cruelty, even though we all hope your right to self-defense extends to when you are being sexually attacked. The reality is much grimmer. Story 22. People in prison for marijuana possession have been affected by changing attitudes. Marijuana has become mainstream, and many believe these individuals deserve freedom and forgiveness. However, many are still not receiving it. Story 23. The lady who sued McDonald's after spilling hot coffee on herself. There was much misinformation about this, and even McDonald's lawyers contributed. McDonald's routinely kept their coffee at a scalding 195 degrees Fahrenheit, just below water's boiling point. The woman suffered third-degree burns on her lap and groin and required skin grafts. This was not a frivolous lawsuit, contrary to what corporate lawyers claimed. While it may seem unnecessary to label coffee as hot, this case resulted in regulations preventing coffee from being kept at excessively high temperatures. Story 24. Anyone who was falsely convicted and sentenced to years in prison based primarily on testimony with little to no evidence automatically comes to mind. Story 25. Everyone who warned that the Iraq War would be a disaster was told they were being disloyal to the United States of America and defiling the memory of those who died on September 11, 2001. Of course, the many people actually maimed and killed in that war should receive their apology first. Story 26. The man who was held captive by his mother in Waterbury, Connecticut, for 20 years. Story 27. Before those children whom we once bullied in school, how much pain and trauma they have endured and still endure because of our childish foolishness. I feel ashamed for myself and for everyone. Story 28. People who took the time to learn history were doomed to repeat it anyway because no one else did. Story 29. I know she is deceased, but Sinead O'Connor deserved better. I realize that she was vindicated during her lifetime, but she deserved an apology every single day from people like Frank Sinatra and others who vilified her. Story 30. Amanda Knox, essentially all the physical direct evidence points against her, yet she appears thoughtful, kind, and intelligent in reality. Story 31. Monica Lewinsky. I thought so when that whole situation was unfolding and she was being harshly judged by the press and the public. It was awful to witness. Story 32. Brooks Laybourne. Society, especially the financial world and the United States government, owes her a massive apology. She was the head of the Commodity Futures Trading Commission in the 1990s and tried to regulate over-the-counter derivatives, complex financial instruments that were growing wildly in the shadows with no transparency or oversight. Bourne saw the danger early. She recognized that these unregulated derivatives, particularly credit default swaps, posed enormous systemic risk. In 1998, she proposed modest regulations to increase transparency. What happened next? The Old Boys Club shut her down hard. Alan Greenspan, Robert Rubin, and Larry Summers, three of the most powerful men in economics, teamed up to humiliate and isolate her. They called her efforts misguided. Summers said, "I have 13 bankers in my office who say if you go forward with this, you will cause the worst financial crisis since World War II. Why was she dismissed so easily? Because she was not part of the Wall Street in crowd. She was not flashy, male, or market-friendly. She was an outsider. Worse yet, she was a brilliant outsider. A physically unattractive woman in her 50s, with no interest in playing the power game or stroking egos, she was treated as a threat, not a colleague. Her gender and appearance made her easier to ignore in a room full of arrogant men who mistook confidence for wisdom. So what happened? Exactly what she predicted. The 2008 financial collapse, driven by unregulated derivatives and credit default swaps, nearly destroyed the global economy. Millions lost jobs, homes, and savings. Lehman Brothers collapsed. American International Group had to be bailed out due to exposure to those same derivatives. It was the very crisis Bourne tried to prevent, and she had the evidence. And those men, they got book deals, speaking tours, and advisory roles. Brooksley Bourne faded into quiet obscurity, her vindication mostly whispered among academics and watchdogs. We owe her more than an apology. We owe her a statue. Story 33. English postal workers were involved in a significant controversy known as the British Post Office scandal. Story 34. The woman from the McDonald's hot coffee lawsuit. That incident was worthy of a case, and people make it out like she sued for a small tongue burn. Story 35. Al Gore was the Democratic candidate whose presidential election was decided by the Supreme Court. He was later ridiculed for being one of the first to speak about climate change. Story 36. Healthcare workers during coronavirus disease 2019. I cannot imagine dealing with mortality at that scale while people are moving around without masks. Story 37. The Chipotle manager was fired for telling these black teens they had to pay before the food was made, and they accused her of racism. The issue was that the manager knew those teens had done this before, but she was canceled before she could defend herself. Story 38. Corey Feldman. He warned us about Harvey Weinstein for decades, but no one took him seriously. Story 39. Henrietta Lacks was an African-American woman who fell ill and died of cervical cancer in 1951. Cells taken from one of her biopsies without her knowledge were used to create the HeLa line of immortal cells for medical research. This was kept hidden from her relatives until 1975. The practice was highly unethical and today would be considered criminal. Story 40. Alan Turing was a foundational genius of computing and artificial intelligence. His work was pivotal in breaking Nazi codes, shortening World War II, and saving countless lives. Society's reward for his service was to prosecute him and subject him to chemical castration for being gay. He died 2 years later. We owe him, and thousands of others like him, an apology that can never be delivered. Story 41. Women historically and in general. The disabled, same. The financially challenged, including those facing poverty. The elderly, especially those who might need help or assistance. The homeless and underhoused. Children with special needs in most public schools. Low-paid or exploited workers. Immigrants of any kind, anywhere. Lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, and asexual persons. Nearly all indigenous peoples on conquered lands. And many more. In essence, our species has significant flaws. Story 42. People in the United States are not aware of the scale and depravity of the atrocities committed against Native Americans. Story 43. The lady who sued McDonald's after spilling hot coffee on herself definitely had more than a right to sue. Story 44. All of the Celts and the Gaels, Native Americans, Indigenous Australians, Maori people, and Palestinian people. Story 45. The West Memphis Three. Specifically, all the people who lied about engaging in witchcraft with them, the hateful individuals who wanted them dead just for being different and spread the story, and most importantly, the West Memphis Police Department. Damien Eccles is permanently disabled because of his prison time. All of them are traumatized, and the real killer of 3 little boys simply got away with it. Story 46. Neurodivergent women who grew up in the 1990s often had their attention deficit hyperactivity disorder or autism ignored because their symptoms did not resemble how boys typically present them. Story 47. Every American immigrant who followed the proper steps to be here was then kidnapped and tortured. Story 48. All of the working class, all those indigenous people killed and displaced by colonial powers, enslaved individuals, revolutionaries, the list continues. Story 49. The Windrush immigrants were among the first West Indians to arrive in the United Kingdom after the Second World War. In 2018, Many of them were declared illegal immigrants and either deported or threatened with deportation because, despite having lived in the United Kingdom for most of their lives and even having British passports, they could not prove how they had entered the country 70 years earlier. Story 50. Timothy Evans was wrongfully executed in 1950 for the murder of his wife and child. He was framed by his neighbor John Christie, a serial killer who was arrested 3 years later. Evans was illiterate and reportedly had the mental age of a 10-year-old. He confessed while in a highly emotional state and out of fear of police brutality. His confession letter was written by the police, and he may not have understood what he was signing. In fact, it was Christie who killed them both. I would argue that Evans was also one of Christie's victims. Derek Bentley was executed in 1953 for the murder of a police officer during a burglary. He had the mind of a child and had learning and mental disabilities. Although he was present during the burglary, he did not shoot the police officer. Bentley was actually in police custody at the time of the shooting. His accomplice, Christopher Craig, pulled the trigger. Because Craig was younger, only 16, Bentley was executed for the killing because he was older at 19. The case depended on one phrase shouted at the time. The police ordered Craig to hand over the gun, and Bentley shouted, "Let him have it, Chris." Both boys defined what those words meant differently. Bentley's legal counsel argued that if the words were spoken, the intent was to encourage Craig to hand over the gun. Bentley's confession was also found to have been edited by police. I believe he was executed to give the appearance of justice because Craig was too young for execution. I believe both men have since been pardoned, but both cases remain terrible miscarriages of justice. I remember watching the film Let Him Have It, starring Christopher Eccleston, about Derek Bentley, and the film 10 Rillington Place, starring Richard Attenborough. Both are worth watching. Story 51. Monica Lewinsky was a young woman who was taken advantage of by an older man in power. Even before the #MeToo movement, I was appalled at the way she was treated. Don't get me wrong, she was not innocent, but she carried a bigger public burden than he did. Story 52. Native Americans, African Americans, gay, lesbian, and transgender people, Chinese immigrants to the United States in the 19th and 20th centuries, families whose children or relatives were affected by various eugenics policies, including forced sterilization, in the early 20th century. Story 53. Those imprisoned for crimes they did not commit due to either honest mistakes or malicious framing. If only this never happened again. Story 54. George Stinney was the youngest person to ever receive capital punishment in the United States. He was 14 years old. He did not see his parents during the entire time he was in jail, up to his execution. During the execution, he had to sit on a Bible because he was not tall enough for the electric chair otherwise. The worst thing is that he most certainly did not commit the 2 murders for which he was convicted. The trial was finished in a single day, and the main evidence was an unsigned confession by George. Story 55. Andrea Yates. The poor woman was begging for help from her doctors, her church, and her husband, but apparently having children was more important to them than supporting her ability to care for them. Her husband was even allowed to check her out of an inpatient treatment center before the conclusion of her treatment and left her unattended at home with the children. Story 56. Miley Cyrus, like many young stars who act out while trying to become more adult with their music or acting, has faced challenges. When the book about Britney Spears was released, detailing the incident where she shaved her head and confronted someone with an umbrella, it provided a new perspective on how many young people in Hollywood do not receive adequate mental health support and are instead ostracized by the public. I believe Miley experienced a similar situation during her Bangers era. As a former Disney star, she struggled to transition into an adult performer and was ostracized, joked about, and parodied extensively. In time, people will come to understand those moments better and realize what was truly happening during that period. Story 57. Native American indigenous peoples suffered greatly. Their land was taken, and they were forced to move west via the Trail of Tears. America was originally theirs. It was taken and called ours. Sincere apologies to all affected. Story 58. Anyone who spoke out against child abuse and was widely criticized by the press, Sinead O'Connor, comes to mind. Story 59, Henrietta Lacks. We should thank her and apologize to her at the same time, as well as to all African American people whose ancestors were born into or lived in slavery. These people were kidnapped, raped, tortured, and taken away from their homes and heritage to be made into slaves against their will. Story 60. Britney Spears comes to my mind. I feel so sorry for that woman. Her whole youth was stolen and her innocence destroyed. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.